When you think of George Harrison, you probably picture the quiet, spiritual Beatle, the man searching for peace and meditation, writing songs that sounded like prayers set to music. But there was one song inside the Beatles' catalog that pulled a complete opposite reaction from him. He didn't just dislike it, he despised it. That song was Paul McCartney's Maxwell's Silver Hammer. At first glance, the track might seem harmless. A quirky tune about a character named Maxwell, with a melody that feels almost playful. But underneath that cheerful sound, it's essentially a story about a college student who takes out his frustrations in the darkest way imaginable. Paul thought it was clever. John Lennon brushed it off as silly. But George, he hated every second of it. Recording the song dragged on for days in the studio. Paul insisted on perfection, pushing take after take, while the rest of the band grew restless. To George, it felt like an exercise in madness. His own songs, like All Things Must Pass and My Sweet Lord, were waiting in the background, but instead of moving forward, he had to sit through endless hours of what he later called so fruity music. It wasn't just about disliking one track. For George, Maxwell's Silver Hammer symbolized something deeper. His frustration with Paul's dominance, his lack of space to bring his own ideas forward, and the growing cracks inside the Beatles. Every hour spent on that song was an hour stolen from the music he wanted to make, and the tension it caused was just the beginning of what would eventually push him to the edge. Because George's breaking point was about to come, and when it did, he walked out on the Beatles entirely. By the late 1960s, the cracks in the Beatles weren't just showing, they were splitting wide open. The Let It Be sessions were supposed to bring the band back to basics, a chance to reconnect with their roots after years of complex studio experiments. Instead, it turned into one of the most miserable chapters of their career. And for George Harrison, it was the final straw. The cameras captured it all. Paul McCartney taking charge, directing others on how to play their parts, while George sat quietly, visibly irritated. At one point, Paul told him exactly how his guitar should sound, pushing George to the edge. George responded coldly, "I'll play whatever you want to play, or I won't play at all." It wasn't just sarcasm, it was resentment boiling over. George had been writing songs that rivaled Lennon and McCartney's best, but he was still treated as a junior partner, fighting to get even 2 tracks on an album. During Let It Be, that lack of respect became unbearable. One afternoon, after yet another clash, George simply put down his guitar and walked out, telling the others, "See you around the clubs." For days, the Beatles were on the verge of collapse. John suggested replacing him with Eric Clapton. Paul and Ringo tried to keep things together. But George didn't budge until he got certain promises, like dropping the miserable live show idea and moving the sessions to a friendlier studio. Only then did he return. But even after coming back, the damage was done. George's walkout wasn't just a dramatic moment. It was proof that the Beatles weren't invincible. The quiet one had finally found his breaking point, and that frustration wouldn't disappear. It would soon resurface in the music he wrote, with a song that revealed just how much he despised the ego games inside the band. George Harrison wasn't just fighting for space in the Beatles. He was fighting against something much bigger, ego. By the late 1960s, George had fully embraced Indian philosophy, meditation, and spiritual teachings that stress humility and selflessness. But inside the Beatles, he saw the opposite. Endless arguments, clashing egos, and a battle for control over every note. It all came pouring out in his song, I, Me, Mine. Written in early 1969, it was George's way of calling out the selfishness he saw all around him. The lyrics mocked the obsession with personal pride and power, with lines like, "All I can hear, I, me, mine, I, me, mine." To George, this wasn't just about society. It was about the Beatles themselves. He later admitted that the song came from his frustration with the constant ego games in the band. Ironically, the title summed up exactly what was tearing them apart. John and Paul were locked in their own creative duel, each determined to prove who could write the better song. George was stuck in the middle, rarely given the recognition he deserved. And while he tried to rise above it with spirituality, the endless studio battles dragged him back down. The final twist? By the time Mine was recorded, John Lennon didn't even bother showing up. The track ended up being laid down by just George, Paul, and Ringo, almost like a symbolic moment, proving just how fractured the group had become. For George, Mine wasn't just another Beatles track. It was a cry of frustration, a coded message about how much the band's egos disgusted him. But as the Beatles dissolved, those same ego battles followed him into his solo career, and the chaos that came with his infamous Dark Horse era. When the Beatles finally ended, George Harrison seemed like the one most ready to break free. His triple album All Things Must Pass proved what had been holding back for years. Masterpieces like My Sweet Lord and Isn't It a Pity poured out of him, earning critical acclaim and chart success. But that early triumph didn't last. Just a few years later, George hit one of the roughest stretches of his career, the Dark Horse era. In 1974, George released his fifth solo album, Dark Horse, and launched a massive U.S. tour. On paper, it sounded like the perfect moment to cement his reputation as a solo star. In reality, it became one of the most controversial moves of his life. His voice was shot raspy and strained from overuse and heavy partying. Critics savaged his live performances, saying he couldn't sing. Some even accused him of preaching on stage, spending more time lecturing about spirituality than giving fans the Beatles classics they wanted. And while the music press tore him apart, George's personal life was in chaos. He had become entangled in affairs, including a notorious relationship with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen, which blew up in the tabloids. Suddenly, the quiet Beatle wasn't looking so saintly. His drinking and self-destructive behavior only fueled the storm. Looking back, George admitted that the Dark Horse era was a mess, both musically and personally, but it also revealed another side of him, raw and unfiltered. He wasn't the mystical figure floating above fame. He was flawed, reckless, and human. Yet even through the scandals and criticism, George kept moving forward. And just when he seemed to be rebuilding, an event decades later nearly ended everything in the most shocking way possible. By the late 1990s, George Harrison had stepped away from the spotlight. He was living quietly at his estate in Friar Park, focusing on gardening, family, and occasional bursts of music. After years of fame, scandals, and touring, he seemed to have finally found some peace. But that peace shattered one night in December 1999 in the most horrifying way imaginable. In the early hours of December 30th, a man broke into George's home armed with a knife. George confronted him, trying to protect his wife, Olivia. What followed was a brutal struggle that left George stabbed multiple times in the chest. For a moment, it seemed like the quiet Beatle wouldn't survive. Olivia fought back fiercely, striking the attacker with a lamp and a fireplace poker until police arrived. George was rushed to the hospital, where doctors managed to save his life. The world was stunned, just as John Lennon's assassination had left a permanent scar on Beatles history. George had come terrifyingly close to meeting the same fate. The attack left George physically weakened and emotionally shaken, already battling cancer. His health deteriorated further in the years that followed. But what stood out most was his reaction. Instead of bitterness, George leaned even harder on the spirituality he had embraced since the 1960s. He spoke about life and death with calm acceptance, saying he saw the body as just a temporary shell for the soul. The stabbing was a grim reminder how fragile even the most private lives could be. For George, it was a final test of resilience, a violent intrusion that forced him to face mortality head-on. And as his life drew toward its end, those struggles, clashes, and brushes with death painted a far more complicated picture of the quiet Beatle than the world ever expected. When people remember George Harrison, they often picture the calm, spiritual Beatle, the one who wrote songs about love, peace, and higher meaning. But behind that image was a man wrestling with frustration, anger, and vulnerability. His hatred for Maxwell Silverhammer wasn't just about one silly song. It symbolized how trapped he felt, forced to watch his ideas pushed aside, while others dominated. His walkout during the Let It Be sessions wasn't a tantrum. It was a cry for respect. And mine revealed just how much he despised the ego wars that poisoned the band he helped build. As a solo artist, George's contradictions only grew more visible. The Dark Horse era showed him his weakest, his voice gone, his personal life chaotic, his image under attack. Yet even through the scandals, George refused to play the saint. He was flawed, but honest about it. That honesty is part of what still makes him relatable. And then years later, when violence nearly stole his life, George faced it with the same quiet resilience that had carried him through everything else. He didn't hide behind anger. He accepted life's fragility and leaned into his faith, even as his health slipped away. George Harrison hated certain things, songs, egos, and the prison of fame, but he also loved deeply. He loved music, spirituality, his friends, and the search for something bigger than himself. That's what makes his story so compelling. He wasn't just the quiet one. He was the Beatle who dared to be real, even when reality got messy. And maybe that's why his legacy endures, not as a saint, not as a shadow of Lennon and McCartney, but as George, a man who fought, struggled, hated, loved, and left behind music that still speaks to the soul. George Harrison's story proves that even the quietest voices can carry the loudest truths. He wasn't perfect, and he never tried to be, but maybe that's why his music still feels alive today. It's honest, it's flawed, and it's real. If you enjoyed this dive into the side of George Harrison most people never see, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe.